The man who wrote that the King of the Jews died on a cross could not have known that within 3 centuries, the King of the Jews would be illegal to write. A wooden placard nailed above a dying man's head, 11 words in 3 languages. Every gospel records it. None of them agree on what it said. By the time the last gospel was written, the inscription had been edited 4 times, and the edits were not corrections. They were territorial markers in a war over who owned the meaning of the execution. One version mocks, one justifies, one evangelizes, one erases. And in the fragment of a 5th gospel, discovered in 1896 in an Egyptian tomb and written before any of the 4 that made it into the canon, the inscription says something else entirely, something that explains why it had to be buried. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why 4 Christian authors could not agree on the words written above the man they worshipped, and what the original version tells us about the single most dangerous claim in the 1st century Roman Empire. Friends, let's take a breath. No one here claims complete knowledge of the truth. Your thoughts matter. Write in the comments where you're from and what you do. It brings the picture to life. If this is interesting, support with a like and subscribe. Now, let's continue. The year is 33, or possibly 30, in the Roman province of Judea. Population, approximately 2.5 million. The province is a narrow strip of contested land wedged between the Mediterranean and the desert, ruled by a prefect named Pontius Pilate, who answers to the legate of Syria, who answers to Tiberius Caesar in Rome. Judea is not important. It produces no grain that feeds the empire. It has no gold mines. Its roads do not carry silk. What it has is religious volatility and a history of armed rebellion that makes every Roman governor sleep poorly. The city of Jerusalem swells during Passover from 50,000 to over 200,000. Pilate stations extra cohorts on the Temple Mount. Crucifixions increase. The message is always the same. Rome does not negotiate with messiahs, prophets, or liberators. The cross is not an execution method. It is a broadcasting system. The body hangs at the intersection of major roads so that maximum traffic sees it. The placard above the head, the titulus, is mandatory. It states the crime. It is written in 3 languages so that every person who passes can read it in at least one. Latin for the soldiers and administrators, Greek for the merchants and educated class, Aramaic for the local population. Standard Roman procedure. Except this time, something went wrong with the message. There is a detail buried in the sources that most people miss entirely. The Gospel of John, written approximately 60 to 70 years after the crucifixion, preserves a piece of information that the earlier Gospels do not. John 19 verse 20 states, "This title many of the Jews read, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and in Greek." John is the only Gospel writer who specifies the order of the languages, and the order is not random. Aramaic first, the language of the accused and his people. Latin second, the language of the authority that issued the sentence. Greek third, the lingua franca of the Eastern Empire, the language of commerce and philosophy and everyone who was neither Roman nor Jew. But here is what reframes everything. The order of the languages tells you who the message was for. If you want to humiliate a man in front of his own people, you write his crime in his language first. Aramaic at the top means the titulus was aimed at the Jews. It was not a legal notice for Roman record-keeping. It was a warning to the population of Jerusalem, the majority of whom could not read Latin and many of whom could not read Greek. The crime was written in the language they spoke at home, in the street, in the marketplace, in the synagogue. This is why the content of the inscription mattered so much that every gospel writer changed it. Matthew, the earliest version we have in canonical form, writes in chapter 27, verse 37, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Mark, likely written within a few years of Matthew or drawing from the same source tradition, writes in chapter 15, verse 26, "The King of the Jews." Luke, writing a decade or so later, gives it in chapter 23, verse 38, "This is the King of the Jews." John, the latest of the 4, writes in chapter 19, verse 19, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." 4 Gospels, 4 versions, none identical. If this were a legal document copied from the official Roman record, the wording would be fixed. Pilate dictated it once. A Roman soldier painted it once on wood. It hung in one place, seen by thousands. There is no scenario in which 4 different people remembering the same placard produce 4 different sentences, unless they are not remembering at all. They are editing. Matthew adds, "This is Jesus." He wants you to know the identity, not just the title. Mark strips it to the bare accusation, King of the Jews, nothing else. Luke restores, "This is," bringing back the demonstrative, pointing at the man. John does something different. He adds geography. Jesus of Nazareth, the only gospel to name the town. Why? Because by the time John wrote, 50 years had passed, and the question was no longer, who was executed? The question was, which Jesus? There were many. Nazareth identifies him, locks him into a place, a region, a class, a Galilean, a northerner. A man from a town so unimportant that Nathanael, in John's own gospel, asks, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" But the content is not the only thing that changes. The theology of the inscription changes depending on who is reading it. To a Roman soldier, King of the Jews is sarcasm. A barefoot preacher with 12 followers is not a king. The inscription mocks the pretension. To a Jewish passerby, the same words are a horror. The placard announces that this man claimed to be the Messiah, the anointed king who would restore Israel, and Rome crucified him for it. It is a public execution of Jewish hope. But to the early Christians writing these Gospels decades later, King of the Jews is a confession. He was the king. The Romans meant it as mockery, but the Gospel writers mean it as truth. And each of them adjusts the wording to make sure you understand what they need you to believe. Matthew needs you to see that this is Jesus. The name means Yahweh saves. The placard is an unintentional prophecy. Mark needs you to see the title alone, stark and unavoidable, because his entire gospel is built on the messianic secret. No one understood who Jesus was until the moment of his death. Luke, writing for a Gentile audience, needs to make it accessible, clear, not coded. This is the King of the Jews, a straightforward statement for people who do not know the Old Testament prophecies by heart. John needs to remind his readers that this was not a myth, not a symbol, but a man from a real place who died in a real city on a real day. But there is a 5th version, and it is older than all of them. In the winter of 1896, a French archaeological expedition in Akhmim, Egypt, unearthed a codex in a Christian monk's grave. Inside was a fragment of a text that had been lost for over 1,000 years, the Gospel of Peter. Early church fathers mentioned it. Serapion, bishop of Antioch, condemned it in the late 2nd century. Eusebius listed it among the disputed texts, but no one had seen a copy since the 4th century, when the canon was closed and every non-canonical gospel was systematically destroyed. The Akhmim Codex contained only a fragment, the trial, crucifixion, and burial. But the fragment was enough, because in the Gospel of Peter, the inscription reads differently. This is the King of Israel. Not King of the Jews, King of Israel. The difference is theological, political, and fatal. Israel is the covenant name, the name God gave to Jacob after he wrestled with the angel, the name of the people chosen before they became a nation. To call him King of Israel is to claim that he fulfills the ancient promise, not just to the Jews as an ethnic or political group, but to the 12 tribes, the whole covenantal bloodline, the unbroken thread from Abraham. But it is also the name that first-century Jewish revolutionaries used to invoke the United Kingdom. The glory days, David and Solomon, before the split, before the exile, before Rome. King of Israel is not a Roman insult, it is a Jewish war cry. Pilate did not write King of Israel. Pilate did not care about Israel. He cared about preventing rebellion in a region that had produced 4 major uprisings in the previous 60 years. He wrote King of the Jews, because that is what Rome called the people it governed. Judea, Judei, Jews, Judea, the province, the population, the problem. But the Gospel of Peter reflects an early layer of oral tradition, circulating in communities that still spoke Aramaic, that still thought in categories of tribal Israel, not provincial Judea. And someone, at some point between the oral telling and the written codex, decided that King of the Jews was not enough. It had to be King of Israel, because only that title carried the full weight of messianic expectation. And then, within a few decades, that version had to be erased. Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, writing around the year 200, says this about the Gospel of Peter. We receive Peter and the other apostles as we do Christ, but writings falsely inscribed with their names we reject, knowing that we did not receive such from our predecessors. He does not say it is heretical, he says it is falsely inscribed, meaning someone else wrote it and put Peter's name on it. But then he says something more interesting. Most of it accords with the true teaching of the Savior, but some things are added. Some things are added. What was added? And why did it matter enough to suppress the entire gospel? The Gospel of Peter does something none of the canonical Gospels do. It removes Pilate's guilt. In the Gospel of Peter, Herod Antipas, the Jewish tetrarch of Galilee, orders the crucifixion. Pilate washes his hands not as a symbolic gesture of reluctance, but as a literal refusal to participate. The Jewish leaders take full responsibility. The inscription is written by Jewish authorities, not Roman ones. And the charge is not a Roman legal accusation, it is a theological condemnation. This is the version of the story that the early church could not afford to preserve. By the time the canon was being formed in the 4th century, Christianity was no longer a Jewish sect. It was a Roman religion. Constantine had converted. The empire had adopted the faith. The enemies were no longer Roman governors. The enemies were the people who rejected Jesus, the Jews. A gospel that said Pilate was innocent and the Jews were guilty fit the new political reality perfectly. Except the Gospel of Peter went too far. It made the Jewish guilt so explicit, so central, that it risked undermining the claim that Jesus' death was a cosmic sacrifice willed by God. If the Jewish authorities killed him out of hatred, then his death was murder, not atonement. The theology collapses. So the Gospel of Peter was condemned, not for heresy, for going too far in the right direction. But before it was condemned, someone read it, copied from it, and adjusted the inscription. Mark, the earliest canonical gospel, has no trial before Herod. Pilate alone condemns Jesus. But Luke, writing later, inserts a scene where Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. Herod mocks him and sends him back, and Pilate says, "I find no guilt in this man." Luke is the only canonical gospel with this scene, and scholars have long suspected that Luke knew the Gospel of Peter, or a source tradition very close to it. If Luke borrowed from Peter, he borrowed carefully. He kept Herod in the story, but gave the final authority back to Pilate. He kept the Jewish guilt, but softened it enough that the Romans still bear legal responsibility. And he kept the inscription as, "This is the King of the Jews," not King of Israel. Because by the time Luke wrote, calling Jesus the King of Israel was dangerous for a different reason. After the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, the name Israel carried the stench of rebellion. The Jewish war had ended in total defeat. Jerusalem was ash. The survivors were enslaved or scattered. To call Jesus the King of Israel in the year 75 or 80, when Luke was likely writing, was to associate him with the failed revolt, with the zealots, with the men who had tried to fight Rome and lost everything. So Luke erased it. He wrote King of the Jews, the safe version, the version that sounded like Roman sarcasm, not Jewish hope. But John, writing even later, in the 90s or early 2nd century, did something bolder. John keeps King of the Jews, but he adds a scene that none of the other Gospels have. In John chapter 19, verses 21 and 22, the chief priests go to Pilate after the inscription is posted and say, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" And Pilate answers, "What I have written, I have written." This scene does not appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It is unique to John, and it does two things. First, it makes the inscription Pilate's decision, not the Jewish authorities. The Jews want it changed, and Pilate refuses. This shifts the responsibility. The charge is Roman. The mockery is Roman. The guilt, at least for the wording, is Roman. Second, it tells you that by the time John wrote, there was a live controversy over the exact wording of the titulus. People were arguing about it. The Jewish Christians wanted it to say one thing. The Gentile Christians wanted it to say another. And John, writing at the end of the 1st century, inserts Pilate into the argument as the one who settles it. What I have written, I have written. In Greek, the phrase is even sharper. Hogegrapha, gegrapha. What I have written stands written. Perfect tense. Completed action with ongoing effect. It is not a dismissal, it is a legal formula, a decree that cannot be revoked. John is telling his readers, the inscription was fixed by Roman authority, and no amount of Jewish protest can change it. Therefore, the version we have, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, is the authoritative version. Except it was not. Because the argument John is depicting did not happen at the foot of the cross in the year 33. It happened in the Christian communities of the 90s when John was writing. And the fight was not about grammar. It was about power. Who gets to define what Jesus' death meant? The people who witnessed it? The people who remembered it? The people who wrote it down first? Or the people who came later with better theology, more converts, and the backing of an empire that was slowly, decade by decade, beginning to lean toward the faith? John chose the last group. He wrote Pilate's refusal to change the inscription as if it were historical fact, when in reality, it was a rhetorical move in a textual war that had been raging for 60 years. And the weapon in that war was not swords, it was words. 11 words, 3 languages, 5 versions. And every version tells you something different about what the writer feared most. Matthew feared you would not know which Jesus this was, so he named him. Mark feared you would miss the irony, so he stripped it to the title alone. Luke feared you would not understand, so he made it a clean statement. John feared you would think the Jews were in control, so he gave Pilate the last word. And Peter, or whoever wrote in Peter's name, feared you would forget that this was not just a Jewish teacher, but the King of Israel, the fulfillment of every covenant, every prophecy, every promise made to the 12 tribes since Abraham. But Peter's version could not survive, because by the end of the 1st century, the claim that Jesus was King of Israel sounded too Jewish, and Christianity was trying very hard not to sound Jewish anymore. The destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 was not just a military defeat, it was a theological crisis. For 40 years, the early Christians had been preaching that Jesus would return within a generation, that the kingdom of God was imminent, that the end of the age was at hand. And then Rome burned the city, slaughtered 1 million people, enslaved the rest, and salted the ruins. And Jesus did not return. The Christians who survived had to make sense of it, and the explanation they developed was this: Israel had its chance. Israel rejected the Messiah. Therefore, the promises made to Israel were transferred to the church. The new Israel, the spiritual Israel, the Israel of faith, not blood. This is called Supersessionism, or replacement theology, and it begins to appear in Christian texts in the late 1st century. Paul hints at it in Romans 9 through 11, but even Paul is conflicted. He insists that God has not rejected Israel, that a remnant will be saved. But by the time of the Gospel of John, the language has hardened. In John chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus tells a group of Jews, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." This is not historical. This is not something a 1st century Jewish rabbi said to other Jews while standing in the temple courtyard. This is John, writing at the end of the century, putting words in Jesus' mouth to settle a fight between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews over who inherits the covenant. And part of that fight was fought on the wooden placard above the cross. If the inscription said, "King of Israel," it affirmed continuity. It said, Jesus is the fulfillment of what God promised to Israel. The covenant continues. The bloodline matters. But if the inscription said, "King of the Jews," it was a Roman insult, and the insult could be repurposed. The Romans meant it as mockery, but the Christians could say, yes, he was King of the Jews, and the Jews killed their own king. Not because the Romans forced them, because they chose it. The Gospel of Peter made that choice too explicit. It had to be buried. But the idea lived on. By the 4th century, when Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea and Christianity became the official religion of Rome, the inscription had been settled. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Not King of Israel. Not, "This is Jesus." Not the stripped-down Markan version, John's version, the longest, the most specific, the one that named him, placed him, and let the title hang in the air as both an accusation and a confession, and the one that made absolutely certain you understood. The Romans wrote it, the Jews protested it, and God let it stand. Because by then, the Roman Empire needed a version of Christianity that did not threaten Roman authority, and the Church needed a version of the crucifixion that blamed someone other than the empire that had just adopted the faith. So the inscription was locked. What I have written, but there is one more version, and it is not in any gospel. In the Jewish Talmud, compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries, there is a brief mention of Jesus in the tractate Sanhedrin. The text is hostile. It calls him a sorcerer and a deceiver. It says he was hanged on the eve of Passover, and it says this: "A herald went forth before him for 40 days, saying, 'He is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Let anyone who knows anything in his defense come forward and plead for him.' But no one came forward, and he was hanged on the eve of Passover." Hanged, not crucified. The Talmud does not use Roman terminology. It uses the Hebrew word for execution by hanging or suspension, the method prescribed in Deuteronomy for blasphemers whose bodies are displayed as a warning. And notice, the crime is not political, it is religious. He enticed Israel to apostasy. He led the people away from the covenant. This is the Jewish version of the